When you think of animals associated with humans, rats are probably not the first thing that comes to mind. In fact, humans and rats seem to have had a rather adversarial relationship. But to put it simply, where humans go, rats have gone, and these strange bedfellows have had a surprising impact on each other's history.
Based on genetic evidence, Jason Munchie South of Philadelphia's Drexel University explained in a 2024 edition of Science that the genus Rattus originated in Southeast Asia in the last few million years and quickly spread throughout Asia and south into Australia and Melanesia. The authors speculate that the original habitat may have been in burrows near grassland watercourses and that their distribution in East Asia over the last several 100,000 years likely depended on glacial cycles. Rats can reproduce notably quickly. Under ideal conditions, a single pair is capable of producing up to 15,000 descendants in a year. There are 64 known species of rats in the world, although the most widespread and the ones with which humans would be most familiar are the black rat and the brown rat. Rats tend to live in highly organized, matriarchal territorial groups, appropriately, if somewhat comically called, mischiefs. The vast majority of rat species are nocturnal, meaning active from dusk till dawn, and most are also subterranean, that is, living in underground burrows. Rats are omnivores and feed on what one expert described as anything organic. They are highly social and rely on social cooperation for survival. They are adept at problem solving, and according to research by Ben Varmarki of the Laboratory of Biological Psychology at the University of Leuven in Belgium, published in the journal Psychonomic Bulletin and Review in 2014, outperform humans in implicit category-based generalization. As Varmarki and his colleagues argue, generalization from previous experiences to new situations is a hallmark of intelligent behavior and a prerequisite for category learning. And this means that in specific scenarios, rats are better learners, essentially smarter, than humans, demonstrating they argue that the more complex brains are not always better. This ability to learn might be part of the reason that rats are synanthropic, meaning adept at living closely with humans. Writing in a June 2020 edition of the journal eLife, Manon Schweinfurth of the Department of Psychology of the University of St. Andrews in the United Kingdom notes that today almost all wild rats live in close association with humans, leading to various forms of adverse interactions. But rats are more than synanthropic, meaning adapted to human environments. They're also communalistic, meaning that they don't just thrive in human environments, but gain resources, such as shelter or transport or food, from humans. Rats live in some environments, such as the Arctic, where they could not survive in the wild, but can when dependent upon humans for shelter or food. This close association is, in a way, somewhat disturbing. As Tobias Linna of Sweden's Lund University notes in a 2023 article in the journal Conversation entitled, "Rats are more human than you think, and they certainly like being around us," that throughout the centuries, rats have been cast as humanity's dark shadow. Raising a bit of an enigma, as Schweinfurth notes in the face of this relevance, it's surprising how little is known about their natural behavior, although he concedes that this is partly because rats, as nocturnal and subterrestrial animals, are notoriously difficult to observe. Today, rats are found across every continent. This includes, quizzically, Antarctica, where, despite the extreme cold, a 2014 study conducted by the British Antarctic Survey found evidence of rats living in and around an Antarctic research station. The connection between rats and human settlement raises the question of exactly how and when the connection occurred. Munch South explains that definitive answers as to when and where rats became commensal with humans have proven elusive. But recent research analyzing DNA from ancient black rat remains found at archaeological sites spanning from the 1st to the 17th centuries in Europe and North Africa by scientists at the University of York, along with the University of Oxford, found that the connection is rather close. An article on the website of the Max Planck Institute, which also participated in the study, explains that the study shows that the black rat colonized Europe at least twice, once with the Roman expansion and then again in the medieval period. The two phases is important. The researchers theorize that the decline of rat populations during the early medieval period is associated with the breakup of the Roman economic system, and the populations returned when towns and long-range trade re-emerged in the medieval period. That is to say, the authors argue that the spread of black rats in Europe was linked to human historical events. The link is so strong that the Institute theorizes that studying the genetic background of human commensal species, like the black rat, can reflect human historical or economic events. That is, rats are so connected to human history that studying the DNA of rat remains allows us to learn about our own history, including how human populations spread and what communities were connected to each other. And that is not only in genetic research. Bethany Brookshire, a doctor of physiology and pharmacology, explained in a 2022 edition of Science News that rats like to collect objects, including, she writes, buttons, old nails, ancient fishing nets, sandals, silver spoons, football tickets, and old hairpins. These objects, found in rat nests, can be used, she argues, by archaeologists and historians to learn about the people around whom the rats live. She notes, for example, a rat's nest that was found behind a staircase of the Oral House of Colonial Williamsburg. A rat's nest discovered during a restoration in 2021, including items collected from the home of the Oral family, tailors, in the 18th century. Brookshire quotes Matthew Webster of the Williamsburg Foundation that the items found help historians find out what the early settlers could make and produce for themselves, and what they had to import from across the ocean. She explains that wood rat middens, large rats' nests that have been occupied for thousands of years, in Oregon include items from Native American populations as far back as 14,000 years ago. These items, such as pieces of woven baskets, sandals, and fishing nets, would usually have deteriorated but remained preserved inside the dry cave middens, giving insights into how humans lived thousands of years ago. As rats scavenged from humans, preserved rat feces can also give insights into human diets at the time. So rats are so connected to humans that they help us to understand lost periods in human history. But have rats changed history? Of course. And one of the most obvious ways is as vectors of disease. Notably, the black rat is often considered to be the culprit carrying the Black Death, one of the deadliest pandemics in human history. But new research suggests that rats may have been unfairly maligned. Rachel Janik noted in Time magazine in 2014 that the plague first traveled from Asia to Europe in the 14th century, but then recurred several times. Scientists assumed that for decades that the plague was persistent because the parasite causing it remained in reservoirs of black rat populations. When a diet was good for rats, dry summers occurred, rat populations would explode, and fleas on the rats would carry the disease to humans, causing its recurrence. But research by Boris Schmid of the University of Oslo Department of Biosciences has called the traditional idea into question. Writing in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, Schmid and his colleagues found that the climate fluctuations that preceded recurring plague outbreaks occurred not in Europe, but in Asia. Rather than being reintroduced from Europe black rat populations, they conclude that the Y. pestis bacteria was introduced in Europe several times, coming via trade routes from Asia. The plague reservoir was in Asia, not Europe. But the rodent population affected by the conditions was not rats. Instead, it was giant gerbils. The idea that the plague-carrying bacteria was introduced once to Europe and reoccurred because of a plague reservoir in rat populations, the study concludes, is most likely wrong. Instead, most likely, a plague reservoir was in the gerbil population in Asia, which, when climate conditions were favorable, increased in population, passed the diseases to humans via fleas, who then carried it to Europe via trade routes. But if rats weren't the plague reservoir that called the recurrences, weren't they the vector, fleas carried by rats, that allowed the pandemic to spread quickly across Europe? Again, maybe not. Research by Catherine Dean of the University of Oslo, published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences in 2018, notes that while it is commonly assumed that rats and their fleas spread plague during the second pandemic, there's little historical and archaeological support for such a claim. Using a comparative model, the researchers concluded that a human vector, that is, spreading via fleas and lice carried by humans, better explains the rapid plague transmission of the second wave than an animal vector. One of the study's co-authors, Professor Niles Stenseth, told BBC News that the conclusion was very clear. The lice model fits best. Professor Stenseth noted it would be unlikely to spread as fast as it did if it was transmitted by rats. It would have to go through the extra loop of the rats rather than being spread from person to person. The conclusion has implications for modern disease control, but it also challenges the idea that you likely were taught in school that the worst disease in human history was spread by rats. Although it's important to note that the research doesn't fully exonerate fleas carried by rats as a vector for the plague. It simply suggests that they were not so central to the story as was once assumed. And that is not to say that rats are not disease carriers. In fact, numerous illnesses, including hantavirus, leptospirasis, salmonellosis, Lymphocytic choriomeningitis virus and tularemia can be spread via contact with rats, their feces, and urine. Murine typhus is commonly caused by fleas carried by rats, and the aptly named and sometimes deadly rat bite fever comes from, well, being bitten by a rat. A 2025 study published in the journal Virus notes that rodents, including rats, are acknowledged as reservoirs for nearly 60 zoonotic diseases. Rodent-borne, though not exclusively by rats, illnesses are estimated to kill at least thousands of people annually, and many of these diseases also affect livestock. And the spread of disease is not the only way that rats cause destruction. Notably, a single rat can consume as much as 23 pounds of food per year, but can ruin, with its shredded hair, feces, and urine, twice that amount. Rats prefer foods rich in protein, and so when they invade agricultural seed, they consume the embryo inside the seed, meaning the seeds will not germinate. The International Food Safety and Quality Network estimates that as much as 22% of the world's food is consumed or destroyed by rodents annually, contributing to world food insecurity. But beyond the normal feeding, a particular phenomenon in northeast India creates devastating local famines. It's called mautam, or bamboo disease. Bamboo is a staple crop in the area, but a cycle occurs every 48 to 50 years when Malacana baccifera, the most common type of bamboo in the region, flowers. Disha Biolia explains in the website Homegrown. The mass flowering leads to the production of a vast number of bamboo seeds, a treat for Mizoram's black rats. In short, the abundant food leads to reproduction, an explosion in the rat population, which, as the seed supply diminishes, then devastate local crops, causing famine. Such famines have been recorded in 1863, 1911, 1959, and 2007. The cyclical disaster has caused at least tens of thousands of deaths and affected regional wars and migration. Another cyclical crisis occurs in Australia when particularly wet years can lead to an explosion in the population of the native long-haired rat. These extremely rainy seasons occur about every 13 to 17 years. They cause an increase in the food supply, which then leads to a massive increase in the number of rats. They then spread, doing considerable damage to crops as well as to electrical wires, damaging cars, farm equipment, and homes. The cyclical population explosion is locally known as a rat plague, and the long-haired rats are plague rats. A rat plague in 2020-21 is estimated to have caused $1 billion in damages. The damage is not limited to plague years, however, as rodents damaging structures and chewing wires, a primary cause of fire, by some estimates responsible for 20 to 25% of fires of unknown origin in the United States, cause an estimated $27 billion in damage in the United States annually. The destructiveness of rats, however, did lead to another change in human culture. The pet rescue site Alley Cat Allies notes that cats began their unique relationship with humans 10,000 to 12,000 years ago in the Fertile Crescent, the geographic region where some of the earliest developments in human civilization occurred. One such development was agriculture. As people abandoned their nomadic lifestyle and settled permanently to farm the land, stored grain attracted rodents. Put simply, agriculture led to grain storage, which led to rodent infestations, which attracted wild cats, who then started hanging around humans. The wild cats eventually were bred into Felis catus, the domestic cat, a direct result of rats' attraction to human food. That attraction has also caused one of the most terrifying of the rat scourges: trench rats. Although the garbage left behind by armies likely attracted rats throughout history, the phenomenon called trench rats was first noted during the Great War, when trenches littered with garbage, debris, and a generally putrid and cramped environment led to large infestations of rats. George Coppard, a private in the Royal West Surrey Regiment, recalled there was no proper system of waste disposal in trench life. Empty tins of all kinds were flung away over the top on both sides of the trench. Millions of tins were thus available for all the rats in France and Belgium in hundreds of miles of trenches. During brief moments of quiet at night, one could hear a continuous rattle of tins moving against each other. The rats were turning them over. The rats spread disease, destroyed supplies and equipment, and perhaps worst, had a devastating effect on morale. One soldier wrote, "I've been bitten by rats several times now, and each time the wound becomes infected. It's just another thing to worry about in this hellish place." Soldiers on both sides had contests for killing rats, primarily with bayonets, as ammunition was needed to fight, as well as keeping cats and dogs in trenches. While trenches, and thus trench rats, were much less common in the Second World War, there were significant efforts to control rat populations that led to the development of new pesticides. But the horror had not ended. The current war in Ukraine is often fought from trenches, a fact that has brought back the trench rat. Christian Edwards wrote on CNN in 2024. The front lines of Russia's war in Ukraine have become infested with rats and mice, reportedly spreading disease that causes soldiers to vomit and bleed from their eyes, crippling combat capability and recreating the gruesome conditions that plagued troops in the trench warfare of World War I. Rats can also be devastating to local ecosystems. Roland McGuire writes on the website of the Center for Agriculture and Bioscience International that invasive rat species are a major cause of species extinction of birds, reptiles, and invertebrates, to name a few. This includes beetles, spiders, and shellfish. They pose a significant threat to the native wildlife on small islands as they outcompete them for vital resources such as food and habitat. In addition, their presence creates disruptions in the ecosystem, making it increasingly challenging for native wildlife to thrive and survive in their natural environment. Invasive infestations traveled along with colonial powers, as Moira Donovan writes on the website of the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation. As rats hopped or swam ashore wherever these ships landed, they destroyed food supplies, decimated native biodiversity, and spread disease. A 1918 infestation from passing ships on Lord Howe Island in the Tasman Sea resulted in the extinction of more than 30 species of wildlife. An infestation of Howdex Island in the Aleutian chain, caused by a Japanese shipwreck in 1780, so devastated seabird populations that the island became known as Rat Island, although efforts to eradicate the rat population have been successful and the island's bird population is recovering. But rats have also been a boon to society in an unexpected way. Sam Shapani noted in Smithsonian Magazine in 2019 that rats have been used for experiments since the 1850s, and in that role, they excel. Oxford University zoologist Manuel Berdoy explained, they reproduce quickly, they are social, they are adaptable, and they are omnivores, so they'll eat pretty much anything. Additionally, the rodent's diminutive size allows relatively easy storage in labs, and their shared evolutionary roots with humans mean the species' genomes overlap overwhelmingly. Accordingly, rats and mice account for some 95% of laboratory test animals in the world. This use has then changed the rats, creating a species distinct from the brown rats from which they were derived. Kuluda Modelinska of the Polish Academy of Sciences explained in 2020, the laboratory rat was the first mammal domesticated for research purposes. These rats have been instrumental in the development of new drugs, including retroviruses for the treatment of HIV, ACE inhibitors for the treatment of high blood pressure, treatment of hepatitis C, treatments for numerous cancers, and pioneering organ transplant techniques. While the use of animals in laboratory testing has undoubtedly saved lives, it raises sincere ethical concerns, which remain even though most animal research today follows guidelines for ethical treatment of the animals. Still, Shapani notes, whether an experiment will end successfully may be uncertain, but one thing is always guaranteed: death of the lab rodents. Rats have, of course, served other purposes as well. A 2022 article in the BBC notes that a Belgian charity is training rats to sniff out the chemicals used in explosives, and thus can be used to detect landmines. Christoph Cox, the founder of the charity, explains that rats are fast. They can screen an area of 200 square meters in half an hour, something which would take a manual deminer 4 days. Too small to set the mines off, when the rats detect a mine, they alert their handler, who can then safely remove it. Despite their often unsavory reputation, rats are not universally despised. In the Chinese zodiac, the sign of the rat is associated with ambition, intelligence, and charm. They're considered symbols of good luck and prosperity. Rats are revered in the Kardimata Temple in India, a 15th century shrine known as the Temple of Rats, or Rat Temple, which houses over 25,000 rats. The animals are worshipped by devotees who believe that these rodents, called kabas, or little children, are reincarnated ancestors and descendants of the goddess Karni. Domesticated rats, otherwise known as fancy rats, have been bred since the 19th century and are a popular pet.
And as rats and humans live side by side, one thing that has changed is the ever-adaptable rat. Rats, for example, have become even more adept at doing things like navigating urban sewers, and frighteningly, becoming more and more resistant to eradication efforts, meaning that rats and humans might continue to share history even if we don't want to. But maybe even more surprising, paleobiologist Jan Zelitzwich noted in a 2015 edition of St. Louis Public Radio that if humans were to go extinct, rats, ever adaptable, willing to eat almost anything and reproducing quickly, are our most likely successor, which means that rats may just well outlive human history. I hope you enjoyed watching this episode of The History Guy, and if you did, please feel free to like and subscribe and share The History Guy with your friends. And if you also believe that history deserves to be remembered, then you can support The History Guy as a member on YouTube, a supporter on our community at Locals, or as a patron on Patreon. You can also check out our great merchandise shop or book a special message from The History Guy on Cameo. Pocky would eat them all, wouldn't you? Yep.